Hi, this is Swapnil Bhartiya, and we are here in San Jose to cover DataWorks Summit. And we have today with us Arun. I mean, we have been talking like
For a
over
long
phone
time, yeah.
or mails, but we never met in person. So it's like nice.
Great to meet you. Yeah.
Yeah, same here. So tell us, first of all, tell us a bit about the summit. What is the new thing that you saw this year?
Yeah, so at the DataWorks Summit, really excited to stand in front of, again, 2,000 plus people, includes customers, enterprises, open source developers, partners, and talk about all of the fruits of the work that the community has been putting together. I mean, we delivered this as HTTP3. That's really, an aggregation of all the work that's happened in the open source community, whether it's Hadoop 3, which is obviously, something that's close to my heart, but also the work, done by the HBase community. It's now HBase 2.0, first major version of HBase in a while. Hadoop 2, you probably remember you and I talked, was 2012. So coming back here, to deliver that in 2018, obviously exciting. It's Hadoop's a significantly more mature
Yes.
project, and having that in a 3.0 state was a lot of work, but also we take a deep breath now, saying, wait, we're kind of gone through it. Same thing with Hive 3. Hive obviously has become the most popular sort of SQL engine, definitely in the big data space, and probably more generally, it's probably the most popular warehouse in terms of amount of data stored in it across the board. So having Hive hit a 3.0 milestone is also really, really exciting, right? In terms of the highlights themselves, Hadoop 3 had, some really key innovations like support for containers. Obviously, containers are really such a trend in technology, and I've been watching, Docker and so on for a long time now. So delivering that in Hadoop 3 was exciting. Now we can actually make sure that customers can run, users and customers can run applications of, different kinds. They have full control over not just the resource aspect of it, but also the software aspect of it, right? Isolation in terms of software. So you can now run different versions of Spark or Python or R or Perl and so on. So that's really great. Similarly, we added a bunch of, we did some key work to add a bunch of innovation around GPU support in here.
Right.
It's a really big deal, given the fact that deep learning is such a massive trend, AI and deep learning, and now you can actually run TensorFlow and such applications natively on Hadoop, where it has all of the data, and leverage GPUs in future things like FPGAs and so on. So we just didn't add GPUs; we've added it. The community added it in a way where you can actually extend it to other resource types like FPGAs. So you can actually leverage all of the sort of newer hardware trends coming around. That's really exciting. On the storage side, we now have HDFS federation, which allows it to scale to billions of objects, and also we added erasure coding for sort of total better TCO. What erasure coding does is you can now take all the data you have, and especially for the cold data, you can start to say, instead of having 3 replicas, erasure, encode it so you can actually have like 1.5 replicas, right? Now, it may not seem like a lot, but if you're talking about tens of petabytes of data, the real savings that enterprises see is massive, in CapEx and OpEx. So that's in Hadoop itself. I can talk about it.
Yes,
I can talk about for hours, but Hive is another great one, right? So we now gotten to a point where Hive is not just a SQL layer on HDFS, right? When they started off, Hive would just be a SQL dialect that you would compile down to MapReduce jobs, right? And the MapReduce jobs would run on HDFS. That's from those sort of humble beginnings, we've kind of come to a point now where Hive is a full-fledged database. We added the ACID support a little bit ago, but this was an early phase of it. But now the ACID support, we call it ACID 2.0, means that you can actually get really, really stringent performance guarantees out of all of the updates that you can do. And tying it back to the use case, I was at Berlin a couple of months ago talking about GDPR, right? And one of the central tenets of GDPR is things like right to be forgotten. And the way to implement right to be forgotten is actually to be able to delete the data in Hadoop, right? You might have a row in your Hive table. You have to do it. So now that you can do this, in a very consistent, expedient manner, really exciting. So ACID is pretty much as fast as not having ACID at all. It's a big step. Similarly, we've done a lot of work in terms of security and governance. Again, in the GDPR case, we've always had Ranger, but the way we've now kind of trying to leverage Ranger and Atlas to do things like consent management, right? So in legacy systems, if you have to implement the use case for consent, where the end user in an EU country, they can come in and opt out of analytics, right? It's not just delete me. They can say, I want to be in your system, but do not use my data in any analytics you do, right? Or these kinds of analytics you do. Now imagine how you do that today, right? In the legacy systems, you have to go rewrite all your apps to change your apps to understand whether their consent is valid or not, and in what context, right? To your point, there could be many shades of gray in terms of what consent they provide. They might consent to being used for anonymous purposes, but they might actually say, don't market it back to me. Some users can even say, just don't use my data at all.
At all, right?
Right?
Yeah.
Now, so you have to go change literally hundreds of thousands of SQL queries in your application space to go do this. Instead, what we showed is now with Ranger, you can actually just set up a dynamic policy, right? And the dynamic policy can just look up a consent table at runtime without you having to change your query at all, right? You can just set a policy which says, if you're accessing this data in this column, make sure you check the consent. And you're doing this without actually changing the application itself.
And it is also for existing applications?
For existing applications, exactly. So now all your existing applications, your hundreds of just work, right?
Okay.
So now, two things. One is we've got the asset capabilities in Hive, so you can actually drop data and so on. Again, it just works, right? You can go to Hive and say, drop this row. Similarly, you can go to Hive with Ranger and say, use this policy, right? So our goal is always to kind of give this to the customers in the most, sort of user-friendly way.
Right.
And doing this means now you can actually keep all your existing data. You don't have to move to a different database, and you can actually keep all your existing applications without changing them.
Right.
Right. So all these are sort of things that got delivered through HTTP3. Again, I have to give credit to the community for kind of doing these sort of innovations at scale, across the board. So really exciting times.
Yeah, and since you mentioned community, what I did notice during your keynote, a lot of open source was mentioned so many times. So when you look at big data and all those things, you deal with a lot of industries that are like been around for like hundreds of years. So what kind of challenge you face when you deal with such industries? Yeah,
I mean, great question. You saw, somebody like FedEx stand up on stage today at the keynotes, and they talked about their journey. A lot of the challenges are, sort of cultural. They have a way of doing things. They have, 30, 50, 70, 80,000 people who are trained on a set of tools, and they've used those tools for, 20 years, right? And they don't want to change, right? So this culture itself is hard. And obviously, part of the challenge now is for us to, kind of operate in that context, while giving, the full fidelity and the full flexibility, use the tools that you want, whether it's Tableau or MicroStrategy or SAS or whatever. But then we can now add innovation, like I talked about the Ranger and the policies and so on, so you can actually continue to use them without having to change any of it, right? So I think it's sort of, yin and the yang, right? On one hand, the open source software itself has to evolve to be, at least as good, if not now better, than any other proprietary offering you can provide, right? It's kind of funny to sit here in front of you. We talked about it in 2012, right? To sit here in front of you and kind of claim that, open source security governance capabilities now are far better than what you can provide than what you can find in the proprietary space.
Right.
That's definitely, it's definitely a thoughtful process that we've kind of put in with the community to go do it. But then similarly, enterprise like FedEx and so on, they're changing. They understand that as the newer workforce comes in, somebody's, getting out of school today is probably learning Python and Spark and Scala and so on. So that sort of change happens too. And, enterprise themselves are understanding that they have to get through a culture of change themselves.
Right.
Because then you saw what Rob said in his keynote, which is kind of your data strategy is a business strategy, and your analytics is so key because only the winners, the winners are going to be the people who can actually run data-driven businesses. I saw this great quote by, the Marriott CEO. We're sitting here in the Marriott, who said we're in an absolute war for the customer, right? And the companies and the enterprises which can understand the customers and provide the solutions that they care about are going to survive, and the others simply won't.
Right.
So that's the world we live in. So we have to obviously have the open source community step up, which obviously they're doing, but also kind of just help enterprises understand, educate them and sort of what changes they have to go through culturally mostly.
So who's going to make this effort to train, or educate enterprise?
It absolutely belongs, that responsibility absolutely, a big part of the responsibility belongs on us, right? As vendors pushing the envelope, whether it's, running analytics on-prem or on the cloud, we have to go help these, companies which have been around for tens, if not hundreds of years, right? We work with a bunch of automotive companies, right? The automotive companies are all over 100 years old now.
Yes.
Right? It takes time and effort, but we also have to help them understand the business value of doing it, not just for the sake of technology. And once we help them understand the business value, it makes a huge difference.
And also, as things are changing, and most of these companies are going through digital transformation, and as developers are becoming the king.
Exactly.
So then that may also kind of become a catalyst.
Absolutely, and one of the reasons why a lot of these companies now pick open source is they understand that if it's Perl, if it's Python or R or Jupyter or whatever it is, that helps them attracts the talent that they need, right? Because otherwise, they kind of atrophy if they can't get that fresh blood. Much like a community, right? An open source community survives and thrives because new people come on and kind of regenerate the culture there. That's what's happening to these companies, and they look at open source as a key way to do that, because otherwise you can't attract the 22-year-old coming out of college today. Like you can't attract and say, come work with us and use technologies which have been around for 40 years. They won't.
Yeah, because most of these developers, they bring their tool set with them, and and there's a huge gap, supply and demand either way. So if you want, you have. Initially, you were mentioning about containerization support and everything. The technology is moving at such a fast pace that we are talking serverless. 6 months ago, we were talking what was serverless, and now people are deploying. And in your use case, a lot of things get triggered, when some event happens, and that's what function is serving. So
real time.
So how is that fitting into picture, and how do you make sure that you keep up with the?
Yeah, great question. That's why one of the things we're most happy about as a company is that we were able to bring the whole NiFi community along, right? When we did the acquisition of Onyara, NiFi was such an attractive proposition simply because it helped to bring that sort of real-time DNA to the company, right? And these guys had been much like how we'd spent 10 years at Yahoo. Joe and the team had spent about similar amount of time in the government building sort of these real-time technologies which move data from every place in the world. And end of last year, beginning of this year, we also got the MiniFi stuff done, which is the mini NiFi stuff. And it's now a small C++ library that you can throw on a doorbell, a phone, a sensor, and so on, and you can collect data. And also, and the community now is working on what they call as command control C2. Getting C2 done for MiniFi means you can actually control the flow of those, millions of IoT devices, whether it's, sensors or Raspberry Pis, in real time from a central console. So doing that and doing sort of event processing, we as a company fundamentally believe that a lot of processing is actually going to move to the edge.
Yes.
Today, if you think about it, most of the data you have to wait till the data comes in to your data center, you make a decision, and then you have to, deploy the model out or so on. We believe, pretty shortly, given the proliferation of these things, the technical architecture or the technical imperative is for you to actually do more of the processing on the edge.
Yeah, and for privacy reasons also, you may not want to move a lot of data in the cloud if you're doing a lot of scanning. Or if you're driving Tesla, you don't want, the cloud to be making the decision.
Exactly.
Latency, and then,
It's just the latency, so, you don't want to hit the laws of physics.
Exactly.
You don't want to get a byte over all the way from, your doorbell or your car to your data center, make a decision and send back, right? You have to be doing it in real time. And we actually believe that will actually, even if it means that you have to store less data, it's actually a good thing, because at the end of the day, the storing data by itself is not the goal. The goal is to actually get analytics and insights as quickly as you can.
Right. While we are talking about the latest technology and all those latest things, at the same time, we also talk about the old companies, So while you keep yourself updated, the company that are your clients, should they dabble with new technology like serverless and all those things, or should they keep up with that, or no, just do it if you want to, otherwise don't?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? I mean, that's one of the benefits of, working, being in the ecosystem of open source is that you get exposed to a lot more technologies faster. If you don't take advantage of it, and I'm not saying go throw it on production tomorrow, right?
No,
I'm saying, like I said, it's part of the cultural transformation to understand that you don't have to wait for a vendor to do something, right? That's how the old school things work. You have shrink track, proprietary software, you give some sort of requirement, the vendor will come back with an answer 3 years later, right?
And you'll apply it in 10 years later. And,
yeah. So that's not the world we live in.
Right.
Part of open source means that, as we've been developing software, the customer doesn't have to wait for us to support it or ship it to actually use it, right? They might not want to use it in production, and that's probably a good thing to do.
Right.
But then you should absolutely be dabbling with it, because that sort of helps create that mindset.
And it's only a GitHub page away, and you don't even need to set up big infrastructure to try. Just spin a container, get it done, leave the VM, you're done.
Or go to cloud, do it. Test it on the cloud.
Either of the cases. So when you look at the evolution of technology itself, as well as the market is changing, IoT and everything is coming. When you look at future, I mean, we cannot talk too far because things are changing. So, what are the biggest challenge that you see is coming up for you, which is realistic?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're here in for the summit, and we typically run this thing called Customer Advisory Board, CAB. One of the things that's clearly top of mind for a lot of them is this notion of hybrid and multi-cloud, right? They're starting to understand how to leverage the cloud, and they're starting to understand that they cannot look at cloud exactly like they look at on-prem today.
Right.
But then they also they're beginning to understand that they need to have a strategy which encompasses not just one cloud but all clouds.
Yes.
Right. And the reason to do that is that they're beginning to realize that each of the vendors will differentiate naturally, right? Take somebody like a Google. They're really strong with machine learning and AI. TensorFlow is really popular today, and the best way to run TensorFlow is on TPUs in the Google Cloud, right? Similarly, Microsoft has a lot of strengths with their enterprise integration. Amazon has a lot of strengths with their operational readiness, right? So if you put all of these things together, the goal isn't to get to the least common denominator. That's like terrible. That's a terrible outcome.
Right.
The outcome we want to optimize towards is how can we help enterprises leverage the best of each of them?
All the yes.
Exactly. Right. How do you put all of them together in a consistent way that you can secure and govern and manage while taking advantage of each of the clouds? So you can totally see how customers and Google themselves were on stage today talking about how they're starting to see customers leverage a particular vendor, a particular cloud vendor for a particular workload. So if it's AI, if it's ML, if it's enterprise integration they need, they're starting to use different vendors. And I think the community is kind of ready to kind of step up and help enterprises leverage each of these things by providing a consistent sort of framework across all of them through an open source methodology.
So when you say community, what do you mean by that?
If you look at all the work that's happening, in the Apache community, whether it's security or governance, whether it's all the work.
Because there can be a lot of communities doing different things.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So we talked about technology, we talked about market. Let's talk about you for a while. Okay. So when you're not doing all
I'm done,
this,
I think.
Yeah. When you're doing
this interview is over. No.
Yeah. When you don't do all of this, what do you do in your free time?
Lots of things. I mean, I have 2 kids, so a lot of my time goes with them. They're 8 and 4. So obviously they're at an age where I get to spend time with them. They're starting to be people and not just cute bundles, right? That's one. I try to keep up with sports.
Do you play or watch?
I used to until very recently, but I still do the usual running, swimming kind of stuff. But it got to a point where I wish I was 25 and I could get kicked by somebody playing soccer on Sunday morning and be up playing tomorrow. But now I got to a point where I get kicked, it takes me like 7 days to recover.
Yeah. And
that's not a viable thing. So I used to play a lot, but now not anymore. So yeah, between these things and obviously there's never enough time to catch up with what's happening with technology anyway.
Right, that's true. Anyway, thanks for talking to me today.
Likewise,
and
pleasure.
hopefully
Thank
we'll
you so
see
much.
you again at the next event or maybe some other open source event.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thanks.